Hey, I'm Jordan Gray, and this is the Intentional Life video series. From sex, relationships, communication, and character development, to health, creativity, and self-love, the Intentional Life is your go-to source for powerful, actionable advice from amazing, world-changing people. Hello, and welcome to the Intentional Life video series. I'm your host, Jordan Gray, and today, I'm stoked to have none other than Kelsey Grant, aka only to me, K Grizzle. Kelsey, so good to have you on the show.
I'm so excited to be here.
So I met Kelsey probably about maybe 2.5 years, somewhere between 2.5 years ago, at an event that I was speaking at that she and her boyfriend were producing, creating, which is now its own movement called Man Talks. And I was a speaker at that event, and I saw Kelsey standing in the corner. I think you were like, not physically taking tickets, but you were like iPad taking tickets, like digitally. Mm-hmm. And I was like, she has an awesome energy. Whatever that person has going on, I already resonate with her. So I'm like across the room. And since then, we've probably done 30 or 40 hours of coaching. Kelsey is one of my coaches that I go to whenever I need one. And yeah, you've probably seen me cry more than most women in my life. That I haven't dated or that isn't my mom. So
I feel like that is an honor.
I appreciate that, and I agree. So Kelsey, from how I most succinctly think of her, you're a self-love coach. Your official title is you are a love and relationship coach, love and relationship educator with your teachings rooted in a radical self-love methodology. Yeah. So give me a sense or two. What does that mean to you? What is your current life's work all about?
The simplest way to answer that is it's all about love and like teaching the mechanics of love and partnership. So the radical self-love methodology, what radical means to me is not this extreme,
go to the spa every day.
It's more like the root of all love. So radical meaning root. So I took the literal meaning of radical, meaning root, and the root of all love begins with the love that we have for ourselves and the relationship we have with ourselves. So every relationship we have, like our relationship to money, our relationship to other people, our relationship to our career, to our spirituality, like it's all a reflection of who we essentially are. And if we have no idea who we are, and if we don't like who we are, that becomes a problem in the relationships that we end up creating in our external life. So that's what it means to me. Getting to the root of things, right down to the bottom, and understanding the purity of love's creative essence and learning how to bring that into all areas of our lives.
I love it. There's already thousands of people watching this that are like nodding their heads along and like, oh, this is why she's the first person in the video series. It already makes sense. Yeah, I've been writing a ton about self-care and self-love recently and making that more in the forefront of the kind of stuff that I'm putting out there because, you put it perfectly. Every relationship in our lives, whether it's to a person or to a thing or an idea or a concept, It's all us. Like everything is a projection of us. Everything that we love or hate all ties back to our self-love and our relationship to ourselves.
Absolutely.
I know that self-care and self-love can be somewhat overlapping concepts in reality, but especially in people's minds. Mm-hmm. What do you see? How do you explain the difference between self-care and self-love? What's the difference between those two things?
For me, the difference, self-care is more of the physical, tangible things that you do to maintain your body, maintain your mind. Self-love is more the spiritual and emotional side. So the psychological side of self-care is what self-love is to me. So really diving into our psyche, understanding why we do the things that we do, and learning to embrace those parts of ourselves that maybe we would want to push away and be like, that's not me. I'm not a jealous person. I'm not insecure. That's not me. I'm all light and love,
Right.
And so self-love takes us on this journey of getting acquainted with our shadow, getting acquainted with those parts of ourselves that we may have disowned, and learning how to embrace them, learning how to understand them and integrate them into the wholeness of who we are, not push them away, reject them. And then the self-care piece is the vehicle in order to get us to the point where we're even open to doing that psychological deep dive. Because if our vessel isn't fine-tuned, there is no way we're going to go on that journey because it'll be too scary. It'll be too confronting. But if we're feeling good in our body, if our emotions have stabilized to a degree, our body feels full of energy, we're much more likely to do that psychological deep dive and be okay with whatever we encounter in that terrain.
Interesting. I've never thought about there being any kind of chronological order, but by the way you described it, it sounds like self-care is somewhat of a precursor to self-love, that if our relationship to our body is totally off, and off the top of my head, if our sleep patterns and complete lack of exercise and any nutrition, like food nutrition coming into our body, or cognitive nutrition in terms of if we're consuming really shitty news or gossip magazines 24/7, then that's going to have a negative effect on our physical bodies, which will then be like, well, if I already treat myself this terribly, then why would I even start to set healthier, appropriate boundaries or be self-loving on a more psychological level? Is that correct?
Yeah. You got it.
Mindfuck. I like it. Okay, so I think self-care relatively between those two concepts is a bit more self-explanatory, and I'll link to my self-care article in the show notes. But what are some either high leverage or powerful or easy intro level ways that we can start being more self-loving interactions?
One of the places that I would always begin is the internal self-talk. So I would start by observing what the general theme of that internal self-talk is. And just the virtue of being aware of what's happening in our inner dialogue is an extension of self-love. Because we're starting to go on that journey and we're starting to get really honest and really authentic about what's there. And that is self-love in action.
Like so looking internally and being like, what are those voices saying to me every day?
Yeah, what is my dominant, thought pattern about my life, about my finances, about my career, about my boyfriend, about my girlfriend, about my mom, about my dad? Like, what are my opinions? What are my judgments? What is my internal dialogue when those things are triggered in my life? And once we're kind of aware of our general landscape of how we're seeing the world, then I would take a look at the dominant judgments that pop up in those areas. So it's kind of a multi-layered process, but those are the good places to begin. Because if you don't know what you're working with, it's kind of hard to transform it, transcend it, evolve it, integrate it, whatever you want to call it. Like, you can't work with it if you don't know what's there.
Right.
And being able to be honest with yourself is one of the most challenging things that I think all human beings they have a very hard time being honest with themselves, especially about the stuff that's maybe a little bit more murky or a little, not so pretty. We can have an easier time admitting the stuff that, we might be good at or at least average at. But to actually go behind the scenes and say, you know what, sometimes I'm really insecure. Sometimes I'm really anxious. Sometimes I'm really jealous. Sometimes I'm really angry. And owning those parts of who we are, because they're just as important as, being joyful, happy, self-expressed, affectionate, loving. Like, it all has its place. And the fact that we reject such a huge portion of who we are, no wonder we're in the place that we're at in the world, where we can't really connect on a deeper, more intimate level with another person because we haven't met ourselves in that deep, intimate place yet.
I love it. Music to my ears. It's interesting. I can't remember what the exact book was or the source where I first heard it, but this concept that, I know a lot of the people that read my stuff, a lot of my tribe are self-employed, and a certain percentage of yours are as well. And just society-wide, that's slightly where the trend is going, anyways. Where whether you're self-employed or just in any career, the way to get ahead financially and like climb whatever your ladder is in business is to be very strengths-focused. What am I already amazing at, and then how do I capitalize on those things to leverage that side of me? Whereas I think with self-love and in any process of intimacy, whether that's intimacy with ourselves or friends, relatives, significant others, it's it's relatively much more not weakness focused, but like, okay, if I'm 9 out of 10 in these things in business, where are my twos and threes that that I'm sprinting away from, that I'm not giving that much attention to? And I love that when you first brought up the, just checking in with what is that dialogue saying. That's identical to if a business client comes to me and says, okay, I want to like scale my business, and you go, okay, like, what are the metrics that are already doing well? And they're like, if they say, I have no idea, and you go, well, we should get our finger in the pulse. We should know what we're working with first and foremost before we can hope to make any kind of changes. Interesting, especially with a lot of things like, the most societally reinforced, women with body image issues, or men, striving for financial success or achievement above all else, while completely ignoring their self-care and self-love. It's those shadow things that completely run our lives that we have the least awareness around.
Yeah, which is mind-boggling to me.
It's such a mindfuck.
It's like, if there's this one thing that is essentially driving our lives,
basically all the time, but we don't know who's driving.
We should probably know a little bit about that.
Who's driving the airplane that I'm always traveling in? Are we going to crash? Probably.
Probably.
So when we become aware of those stories, what do we then do with them? If there's one or two primary, damaging dialogues, we go, oh, I have a really messed up relationship to money, to sex, to my body, to intimacy in general, to vulnerability. What do we then do with, there's this thing, I'm a jerk to myself all the time. Is it a matter of reframing it or shifting it?
I mean, there's an entire process of like shifting the mindset and having the heart go with it. So if we are just working with the psychological side of things, we're going to get to a point where we feel pretty stable, but there's not a lot of depth or richness to our experience. And if we only go on the spiritual side of things, we are never going to get in touch with the depths of who we are.
Spiritual bypass.
Yes. Yeah. And so we need a blend of the two. So let's say like the issue is vulnerability, which, is a pretty common thing.
Yeah.
Like, I don't want to be vulnerable. What if that person hurts me? If I give them this information, they have, everything that they need to hurt me.
Right.
So of course we want to keep that locked down. And where I would, advise someone to begin is, what parts of your life would you actually be comfortable being vulnerable in and telling the truth? Like, vulnerability and authenticity go hand in hand. So where in your life can you tell the truth and really own it? And if relationships are that really murky, deep place where you feel like almost overwhelmed by like dealing with the, vulnerability issue, don't start there.
Yeah.
Like, just don't. Start where it's easy and build the muscle. Like, I think about it in terms of how I would train for a marathon. If I was going to train for a marathon, I wouldn't just show up on run day and try and complete the mission.
I'm ready, I guess.
I'm ready. Hopefully my body responds well and I have the stamina and stability to do this.
Hopefully I'm not hospitalized in 3 hours.
Like, it's just stupid. But that's how we are in terms of our wounds and our places of vulnerability. We think we should just be able to get right to the finish line.
Sprint through them.
And be able to see these extraordinary results, when in fact we have to train every single day in order to get to the point where we're comfortable opening the door to our deepest wound. And one of the places that I would start is like, where are you comfortable? And how can you amplify that on a day-to-day basis? And start building that muscle like repetitively. And the thing about these mindset muscles is we need discipline and consistency. So if we're not repeating the practice every day, it's not going to stick. And if we're not disciplined, like, we have to be disciplined in order to repeat and be consistent. And so we've got to look at the actual values and qualities that are behind being able to fulfill on that mission. So a lot of people have a really wonky relationship with being disciplined because they compare it to being controlled. And I don't want to be controlled, even if it's for my highest good, and I'm going to get everything I've ever dreamt of because I can actually discipline myself in the things that actually have me be my best. So I would start looking at the relationships people have to discipline, to consistency, to commitment. And that will give us a huge amount of insight into why the results are the way that they are. And if we can build those muscles of commitment every day, and I mean, if we're going to talk about self-love, like having a self-love or self-care routine. So people will want to go from 0 to 60, having no self-care or no like routine to 50 things that they need to accomplish before 7 o'clock in the morning. And then
do them
wonder
flawlessly and every day.
every day. And then when that doesn't happen after day 2, because that's about the amount of time we can maintain that.
The amount of failure that we can handle until we go, oh, I'm messing up too much.
Yeah, and then we totally deep dive and we dip, and then it's perfect ammunition for our inner critic to grab hold of and reconfirm all of those wounding patterns, wounding stories. Like, see, you're a failure. See, you're never enough. See, you're stupid. And so we have to set ourselves up for success, and doing these small things consistently allow us to expand the amount that we're taking on every day. But if we try and take it all on without building the muscle or the capacity to hold it, we're just going to set ourselves up for failure, and we're not really going to get very far.
I love it. Yeah, that's totally consistent with every realm of psychology that I've ever studied, is this concept of flooding versus progressive desensitization. That there are some schools of thought, or at least some coaches, leaders, practices that are along, oh, you're afraid of this thing? Well, only that for the next month. Yeah. And just throwing someone in the deep end and psychologically flooding them. Whereas, my experience has been exclusively that any behavior change in terms of your behavior, your emotionality, your psychology around your wounds is always, where's the easiest baby step? Let's not start with a 10 out of 10 anxiety producing thing. It's what's a 4? What's maybe a 5? Like what's something, what registers like, oh, like this is kind of a challenge, but it's not so terrifying that A, you're less likely to even begin, and B, you're way more likely to give up when you feel like you're failing on the task every day or constantly. Like, oh, I told myself I'd have more self-compassionate self-talk, and I had a negative thought today, and this is my second day, and like the punishment culture that we have around like snapping an elastic on your wrist, which is like, yeah, that's good. When you notice a thing, punish yourself, because that's totally going to help long term.
That's going to work.
Yeah, just associating more pain to your already very deeply embedded wounds.
Yeah. We could tangent on this for days, I think.
Forever. Oh, man. So this can overlap in self-care and self-love practices, but is it a highly individualized, very case-by-case basis of everyone's self-care and or self-love practice has to be hyper tailored to them, or is it somewhere between that and there are some universal truths that everyone can benefit from these kinds of things?
I mean, I personally think that a lot of our self-care, a lot of our self-love is unique because there's no two people on this planet that are the same.
Right.
And I also think that there are a couple things that tend to work really well for the majority of the population. Keeping your body hydrated.
It's simple, it's so overlooked.
Yeah, and this is based in science. Like, our bodies are made up of so much of water, and if we are dehydrated, we are going to really impact our brain function. And if our brain function is impacted, the entire system is compromised. So a simple thing like regulating your water intake and like high quality water intake is something that I think everybody on the planet could really benefit from. That is a universal, self-love, self-care concept. Another thing that I think is really effective is meditation. Now, everyone has a different relationship to meditation, stillness, whatever you want to call it. And for some people, guided meditations are more their jam. Other people just need to sit in total silence. And there's, somewhere in between those extremes where you're going to find your sweet spot. And the process of really quieting the mind and quieting the body and making the body still, I find is very effective for getting in touch with those stories, getting in touch with that inner dialogue. Because if we're constantly distracting ourselves and busying ourselves, it's challenging, not impossible, but challenging to get a really solid grip on what those stories are and maybe the underlying themes behind them. So I would say those two are pretty universal. And, depending on the style of meditation you like, that's where the flexibility comes in. But without it, I rarely see anyone really take off in their self-love and self-care journey without that piece. And then everything else is kind of custom tailored to who you are, what your personality type is, what your wounds are, like what you're here to learn, what your strengths are, what, your weaknesses are, your life experience, your history, your childhood, like all of these factors play a part in what will be effective in your self-care, self-love journey.
What I love about both those things is that they are, they're those kinds of seed habits that have such a high leverage impact on, a dozen other processes in our lives. And it's funny, I mentioned the hydration thing in one of my articles on hormonal balance and like boosting sex drive. And I talked about keeping hydrated and also doing oil pulling, like swishing coconut oil around your mouth. And both those things, what's that question? Like some of the, like the best advice is simple, but not necessarily easy, or especially not necessarily done. And when we're dehydrated, like our brain function suffers, our kidney function suffers, our hormonal balance goes out of whack, our sleep suffers, like
digestion, everything.
Totally. It just touches every system. And that, I remember like doing a deep dive into the research of oil pulling because I had previously only heard that advice or that concept from Elephant Journal and from like all my most hippie-ish friends. And it was like, like all these amazing health benefits. Like it treats like psoriasis and acne and helps you sleep better and improves digestion. And like, the laundry list was like 30 things long. It was like, these are all proven. And I was like, how can that have any validity? But I looked into it and, treats cavities and gum disease and makes you a millionaire, like all these things. And it was one of those things that was like, yes, this, like that, just that moment of swishing around coconut oil doesn't necessarily cure all the diseases in your entire life.
Problems,
But by taking care of your oral health, that does impact your digestion and your kidney function and like all these things by association because, you are still in your dozens, millions of transactions and processes that are happening in your body. You are still one process. You are just one thing that you can take care of that much better, that it does impact everything around it. The sleep thing or the meditation thing, I think that the word meditation can be intimidating, especially for people that have never done any version of it. And I know for me to be able to get into any version of it, I had to really sit with this idea that it isn't one thing. That some people think that meditation has to be you seated in a chair with your feet flat on the ground, your palms up in the air, probably doing the like, the meditation finger and thumb, which 99% of people, myself included, don't know what that means or what it's supposed to do. And, it has to be this one way of sitting in silence and having zero thoughts, which again, in terms of that seed habit, getting into a simple practice, people can just feel like they're failing at it right away because they're like, I'm trying to have no thoughts. I'm definitely having thoughts. I'm not cut out for this. And then they just stop. And for me, the turning point, when I really turned the corner was when someone, I think it was John Kabat-Zinn, talked about how meditation and mindfulness were basically the same thing and how I could tie that to flow states or being in flow, like Mihai Csikszentmihalyi talks about in all of his books that I've read, maybe not all of them, that being in a flow state can be its own mindfulness practice, can be its own meditation, and that for some people could be playing badminton with someone who's at their equal skill level for an hour and just being so in it that even if they're working 70-hour work weeks, life just has to fall away because they're so in something. Yeah. But that really simple seed habit could be whether you wake up to an alarm or not, when you wake up in the morning, laying on your bed and just breathing for 90 seconds. Boom, you just meditated. Even if you have thoughts, not judging yourself for having thoughts, just being like, cool, I'm having thoughts. I'm just going to focus on breathing more deeply than I do most of the day for a minute and a half. Like that's a seed habit that's totally valid and worthwhile to give you some peace of mind that does permeate through your entire existence when it's a cultivated habit.
I think that's one of the Things that I dislike most about the meditation world, and sometimes the more super spiritual side. I mean, I'm very spiritual. I'm very woo woo. I'm very hippie. Like,
Yeah.
I'm not dissing it.
Whenever I introduce you to people, I'm like, she's like more hippie female me. And they're like, okay, cool.
Okay, great. But that whole belief of meditation is only effective if you have
If done
no thoughts.
properly.
Yeah, which is ridiculous. Like, your brain is constantly going and your mind is
Yeah.
going with it. And it's a matter of being aware of the content that it's pumping out when it's going a million miles a minute. And, eventually, we do get to these places where we have these experiences of stillness or quietness of the mind. But they're literally like 1 second. And then we realize we're like, oh, I just had one of those. And then the brain starts going. So, I mean, unless we're a Zen monk and like that's our divine purpose of being on this planet is to have a mind of stillness, which is a very small portion of the population. It's one of the ways in which we can attack ourselves is by thinking that we're supposed to be doing it a certain way and then we're not meeting the standard, and then that's the trigger to get down on ourselves, beat ourselves up a bit more, and then we spiral downward. So if we just debunk that right now by saying your meditation is what it is, it's going to be an expression of you. And there are going to be days where your brain is going wild. And can you sit with that? Can you be with that? Not necessarily like sit in silence, but like, can you be with that? Can you be with reality as the way it is? And that's a huge practice of self-love, is making peace with reality. Like making peace with right now, what's happening right now, whether you're, stillness in your mind or like total monkey mind, or you're feeling really happy or you're feeling really shitty. Like, can you make peace and like actually accept that that's your reality? And meditation can be this beautiful vehicle for training us how to make peace, or acceptance of the present moment, acceptance of our reality in its totality. So like, our reality isn't just beauty and love and happiness and wonder. Like, there's a whole other spectrum here, and but we somehow like put this blinder on that, nope, that doesn't exist, that shouldn't exist, like that's wrong, that's bad. What if it wasn't?
What if it just was its own thing and it's allowed to be there?
Yeah, and it's part of you, and it's essential for your well-being. I know that's kind of a weird way of thinking about it, but what does anger provide for you? Well, it lets you know when a boundary has been violated. If you didn't have anger, you would be walked all over all the time and you wouldn't even know it. And your self-care, your self-esteem, your self-confidence all would just disintegrate. So, like, I know we're kind of spiraling from the whole meditation conversation, but it's part of it. Like, that's, if we can create acceptance for whatever shows up and to give ourselves the flexibility to meditate in a way that makes sense today. Today, it might make sense for me to sit in stillness because maybe I'm a little bit more tired and that's all I feel like doing. And maybe tomorrow my energy is like through the roof and I can't sit still and I go on a walking meditation. And the purpose,
dance to your favorite song in your living room.
Exactly. And it's just a matter of like really claiming our power and saying, this is what works for me today, and know that it's probably going to change tomorrow, because like, we never actually stay the same moment to moment. Like, our body is constantly changing and evolving, and like cycles of death and rebirth. And so to think that we have to be consistent and the same every single day is ridiculous.
And purely an ego construct of just like, oh, but I have to like maintain the same narrative, the same story. I have to be myself. It's like, what's the figure? It's like every 7 years, every cell in your body is completely changed and regenerated, so that you're like physically, like on the physical, molecular level, none of you is the same as 7 years ago. And yet we have to be, oh, but I have to be this profession. I have to be in this relationship. It's like, if things stop serving you and everything has changed about you and the world is only changed, then you're also allowed to change.
Absolutely.
One of my favorite quotes, concepts, again, I don't know the source, is no man steps in the same river twice, because the river changes and the man changes. So true.
So true.
On a totally unrelated tangent, That thought came to me when I was talking to a friend about going back to Ubud, Bali, which I was there exactly 3 years ago from this month. And, I've seen photos of how, when I was there, there's this entrepreneurial community called Ubud, and there was like 5 entrepreneurs in this little hub, and like it was brand new. And now there's people, mutual friends of ours that are posting photos of being in there, and there's like 120 people in there at every moment. And I'm like, whoa, like, a part of me wishes, like my ego is who's like grasping to want to go back to that same river. It's like the river's absolutely changed and I've changed. So there's some parts like, no, maybe I should just honor the memories as they were. Nothing to do with self-love, but yes, the world is constantly changing.
Well, making peace with reality is a function of self-love. So
True. It's all self-love.
It's all self-love.
Final question. This one might be tricky / potentially impossible.
Oh, I love this.
No pressure.
Saving the best for last.
So if this is even possible, is there a way that we can encourage more self-loving behavior in others? And, while being aware that we're not just like finding people that seem like they have no self-love because we're projecting and we're really not spending any time on our own. If we have parents, friends, partners that, maybe you've made a bunch of leaps and bounds in your self-care, self-love practice, and, maybe you hear their thought patterns as still overly self-defeating. Is it just a matter of saying, here are my practices, what do you think of these? Or like, how can we lovingly encourage those kinds of trends into other people, if at all?
I think one of the things that's really missing in our communication as a whole, as a culture, is the function of asking permission before we launch into our therapy of another person.
Here's what you need to change. Yeah.
So I see that you're dysfunctional, so let me tell you how to change. Like, it's ridiculous. And something that is really effective and really self-loving is allowing someone the freedom of choice. And so really honoring their free will, because you don't know what they are here to experience, what they are here to learn, what they are here to overcome. And if your life is on purpose, like no matter what's showing up, guess what? So is theirs, even if it's uncomfortable to watch. And one of the things that you can do is ask, hey, I see that this has kind of been a reoccurring theme in what you're talking about. I've gone through something similar. Would you be open to me sharing with you how I, shifted that? Or you just need to clear? Like, what do you need? What do you need from me right now? How can I be of service? That is one of the most self-loving things that we could do to possibly trigger self-love in another person, because we can't force other people to change.
No.
And nor would I ever want to force someone out of an experience that they are clearly meant to be having because they're having it.
Yeah.
And if I try and solve their problem, I take away their capacity to build their confidence by breaking through that on their own.
Yeah, you definitely suffocate their growth by being like, oh, I can fast track you, but like they don't need to be fast tracked.
No. And so asking permission, like, would it be okay with you if I shared, what was effective for me? Like, do you actually want to hear that? Or what do you need from me? And if they continue to not want to hear any alternatives, not want any help, guess what? You need to put a boundary there and stop enabling them. Stop hanging around and listening to their pity party. A good rule of thumb is listen to a complaint or a problem or a breakdown 3 times. And after it goes past the point of hearing the same story 3 times, you are now in the territory of enabling their wound. You're strengthening their wound by listening to it. And then you start catering your behavior to dance around their wound so that you don't touch it. And
you walk on those eggshells like, oh, I know it's a thing for you, so I'll just be overly gentle and let you keep suffering for eternity.
Yeah, and so one of the things that we can do to trigger self-love is by putting those boundaries in and walking away. Especially if you've done the work before. Like, I wouldn't recommend being a jerk and being like, fuck you, I don't want you in my life anymore. Like, you just complained 3 times in a row.
Right.
That's ridiculous.
3 strikes, you're out. No more friends.
But if it's a persistent complaint that always shows up for them, and you've offered, with permission, like, can I provide you with something that might be more effective, or do you want support with this, or what do you need? And they continually shut you down 3 times, is a good rule. Then you got to walk away. And even though it's tough, even though it's going to be really challenging for us on the outside seeing someone that we love suffer, we also have to understand that their free will is doing its own thing. And you've offered support, you've offered guidance, you've offered to be there. And at that point, you've got to step away. And sometimes when we step away from those relationships, it's a big enough wake up call. It's a big enough shake to the paradigm that that's what triggers them to go down the path of self-discovery, which inevitably leads them into the path of self-love, whether it's called that or not. Self-confidence, self-awareness, anything
whatever.
Yeah, it's all self-love, just a different title, and so sometimes that tough love, putting the boundary up, is the best way to trigger self-love in another person. After you've, done the whole permission thing, can I support you? What do you actually need from me right now? Sometimes we just need to vent, and we just it's not about being politically correct or any of that. We just need to get it out and do a little bit of that shadow release, and then it's gone, it's cleared. But for some people who don't have maybe some of that psychological training, they start looping.
Yeah.
And they start repeating the same stories, the same complaints, and the same issues over and over and over and over as a way to gain attention. And they're using their wounds to essentially manipulate other people. It's not a conscious thing, it's a totally unconscious thing, but that's what's happening. Wound manipulation. I've got this pain point and I'm going to manipulate power, by airing my wound and not doing anything about it, so that you tiptoe around me and give me the attention, affection, acceptance, validation, all of those things that we're seeking, but we're seeking it from a shadow perspective. So to move into our integrated perspective, we have to take a look at that. We have to take a look at our own wounds, and we can't design our lives around them. If we know our wound and then we just use that as a way to, keep people at bay, or, we don't do anything with it, there's no real point in knowing that.
Right.
If we know our wound and then we use it to become more psychologically aware, and we notice, oh, right now I'm feeling triggered. Am I triggered because my wound got touched? Oh, it did. Oh, okay, great. What can I do differently? That's the process that we want to get to, is you change your behavior when you notice your wounding got triggered. Not other people need to cater to it,
Yeah.
and you're just going to keep it active for the rest of your life because it's a good power play.
That thing that you notice, and you're like, oh, that's my sneaky little friend trying to be a wound again, as opposed to taking it and using it as the shield of hey guys, remember my money issues, or I was abandoned, or this thing that you have to all walk on eggshells around me because this is my thing. And
Yeah.
I think there's tons of literature coming out around, mainly opinion pieces around not wound culture, but trigger culture, that everyone has to be overly cautious with, trigger warning for this and this. It's to the extent where in Fahrenheit 451 style, people are banning books from university campuses because this has a rape scene in it, or this has abandonment or whatever, that we have to now remove literature to avoid people having their unfaced wounds potentially triggered on university campuses. Not not kindergarten, but for developed brains that are in higher education. So
That's pretty wild stuff.
we go to great lengths to not face our stories. I could jam on this stuff for hours, clearly. So if you, the viewer/listener, are resonating with Kelsey's style as much as I am, and always have, Kelsey, where can people find out more about you? What's the main hub?
The main hub would be my website. So kelseygrant.com.
Right.
Very easy to find. Yeah.
I'll link to that in the show notes. I know that you're working on some group coaching right now. You've got some limited spots for one-on-one coaching. So people have many opportunities and options to work with you
Yes.
should they desire.
Yes, they do.
Awesome. Kelsey, thanks so much for being on the show. Pleasure
Thanks
to
for
have
having
you.
me.
Anytime. All right. See ya.
See ya.